Kyle, who do you think it hurt Daryl Morey to let go of more? PJ Tucker or James Harden?
Oh man, the band has all been broken up, right? The whole thing last year was that James Harden was paying back $14 million so that they could bring back PJ Tucker and Daniel House, who again, Daniel House got thrown out of the NBA bubble and they brought that whole squad back together. And I just can't believe that they're going together. That's the funniest part, right? Daryl Morey said, if I'm going to get rid of James Harden, I'm going to get rid of every trace and element of that team that we tried to assemble from last year. That is funny.
But on the bright side for Philadelphia, at least they get Robert Covington back. I mean, Philadelphia's favorite son, Robert Covington, returns to the 76ers. So that's a world of difference right there, right?
Isn't that a weird, like, fucked up way around this? Because, like, Robert Covington was one of those players that best embodied the process. Like, I believe he was an undrafted player. I believe he was on the original 76er team that lost more games by percentage than any team in NBA history. I think Robert Covington was one of those original process players. And then when he got traded to Minnesota for Jimmy Butler, that was kind of the symbolism of like, the process is over. We are going all in. We are trying to win a championship. And that was like 3 all-in trades ago for the Philadelphia 76ers at this point. It's kind of wild how that worked full circle to now we've made it back to Robert Covington back on the Philadelphia 76ers. After December of 2018, they made the Butler trade. It was like 2018, we're going all in. And now 6 years later, we're back to Robert Covington.
Okay, so which team do you want to tackle this first from? The Clippers point of view or the 76ers point of view?
I think the 76ers is more interesting, right? Because the Clippers, it's pretty self-explanatory where they're going. I think the 76ers are more interesting.
So yeah, let's talk about like the trade details a little bit. So I mentioned Robert Covington. They also get Nick Batum, a 2028 unprotected first round pick, 2 second round picks. Pick swap is involved in there as well. They did have to waive Danny Green as part of this, so they're going to be expected to have some younger guys get more minutes out there. I think the biggest winner out of all of this is Tyrese Maxey. Through 3 games, he has looked really good. He's looked like he's filling in even better in many ways than James Harden is at this point in his career. So I think Tyrese Maxey, the fact that his development gets to continue in this new system that Nick Nurse is employing in Philadelphia, is an absolute winner of this trade.
Yeah, I think that Tyrese Maxey can be a legitimate number 2 on a very good team. Like, it might just be a numbers game in terms of all-star, so I don't like to say like he could be an all-star or whatever, because it's just like 12 players and there probably should be 15 all-stars in the NBA, but he is a tier 4 player. Like, he is someone who's not going to be a number 1 on a team that's good, but he's a legitimate all-star caliber player.
But can I add, though, in the playoffs last year when the 76ers and Celtics were playing each other, I was more scared of Tyrese Maxey whenever he had the ball in his hands than I was of James Harden whenever he had the ball in his hands.
That's interesting because James Harden cooked the Celtics in the playoffs.
He had
not
2
in the
games.
last 2 games.
He had 2 games in there. You're right. He had that one 46 or 48 point explosion, sure. But for more consistency throughout the course of the series, I thought Maxey was a more imposing or troublesome player for the Celtics.
I don't think you're crazy. I mean, Harden is clearly a declining player, and Maxey is what they hope to be an improving player. I mean, Maxey is entering that kind of like weird purgatory where it's like, hey, are you going to take the next step, or is this going to be the player that you are? And this is, I would assume, the biggest focal point Maxey is going to be in an offense around Joel Embiid. I mean, I don't know what team is really like opening themselves up to like making Tyrese Maxey the focal point of their offense, but he's their number 2 now. Like, he is clearly their number 2. He's one of the better late round draft picks that has been developed. And I think the reason this whole thing still has a puncher's chance for Philadelphia, granted it's not much of a great puncher's chance at winning the Eastern Conference, but the reason they'll continue to be competitive is because of Tyrese Maxey still being the number 2. In terms of the trade itself, the 76ers obviously sold themselves short. The deal at the end was, can we get Terrence Mann? And the Clippers said, no, you cannot have Terrence Mann. And Daryl Morey was trying to get any leverage that he could out of a trade, and he just couldn't find any teams that were willing to take the bait. And so at the end of it, he compromised by getting an additional protected first round pick from the Oklahoma City Thunder. Like that seemed to be the thing that pushed it over the edge, was that the Clippers sent a pick swap to OKC and OKC sent a protected first to the Sixers. So like that was the compromise they got at the end. It was like, well, we can't have Terrence Mann, so I guess we'll just take the original framework for the deal and add an extra protected first round pick in, which isn't great. But Terrence Mann's, I mean, even though Terrence Mann put up 40 points in a closeout playoff game for the Clippers, like Terrence Mann isn't something that should have been 5 months worth, or not 5 months, 5 weeks worth of stalling out on getting this trade done. So, I mean, the 76ers lost the trade, but the 76ers also did the best they could given the circumstances. They had one single bidder. They had a player who was probably never going to come back and play for their team again. And ultimately, they didn't get a deal that is worthy of what they were giving up at the end of it. And I still think that even though they lost that deal, this was the deal that was always on the table. It was the only deal on the table. And they got their 70 cents on the dollar for a player that if they hadn't, maybe tricked him into saying that they would facilitate a trade by opting in, they might have lost James Harden for nothing. So I guess 70 cents on the dollar is better than losing James Harden for nothing.
So some other players that were also involved in the trade I didn't mention, Marcus Morris and KJ Martin, a couple of journeymen in the NBA that have been around the block. So those are also added to this 76ers roster. I would argue, though, that this 76ers team, they're 2-1 right now. They could have been 3-0 if it wasn't for Dame Lillard making some clutch shots late against the Milwaukee Bucks. So they're not that far off. And adding more depth when you are already getting 0 points from James Harden, he wasn't helping you while he's getting kicked off team planes. So James Harden was a non-factor on this team through the early point of the season already. So I think adding these pieces, adding more depth to this roster is a good thing. And this might not be the final version of the 76ers roster this season. Obviously, we've seen them being able to move off Danny Green and other veterans that they got real quick as well, moving off PJ Tucker's contract with 2 years remaining on that. So Daryl Morey did say that if he couldn't get a superstar back, he would get the pieces to be able to acquire a superstar or acquire another complementary piece for this team. So, you think about some of the other teams that are struggling out there. Spicy P out there in Toronto has been a trade target mention. Zach LaVine from Chicago. Do you see the 76ers being aggressive the rest of this year as, they try and keep Joel Embiid happy because all eyes turn to Joel Embiid now?
Yes, I don't think they'll just stash those draft picks for when Joel Embiid ends up leaving. I don't think that was the game plan at the end of this. If I remember correctly, so they walk away now with 3 first-round picks and a pick swap, if I remember correctly. I think that's what they walked away with at the end of this deal. And those picks aren't really worth a ton right now, so I don't think they'll be able to get a player better than Tyrese Maxey in a deal, but I do think they could get a player better than Tobias Harris in a deal. If they package the bundle of assets they have together, they could probably make Tobias Harris their 4th best player again, and that's probably the territory that they want to be in, but it's tough. I think that the 76ers, the bones of the team are pretty much set. Like, you're going to have Joel Embiid, you're going to have Tyrese Maxey, and you're going to have Tobias Harris for what I assume to be the foreseeable future. Like, that seems to be the 3 players that are set on the roster. Everything else you can kind of tinker with on the periphery, but I don't really know if there's any other players that are really making a dramatic impact for the Sixers. The best thing I can say is that they have 10 players who are capable NBA players and capable of giving them significant minutes. The thing that's going to get them a 3rd best player better than Tobias Harris is packaging those draft picks to a team that is not looking to contend at the moment. Like a team that has not an all-star, but kind of like a 2nd tier, 3rd tier kind of player who could be a number 3 on the Sixers. I think that's more the market that they're in.
All right, let's get some Clippers talk in here. So the Clippers acquire James Harden. They add PJ Tucker to this lineup. The Clippers, we already know that they have 2 superstars and a player in rapid decline in Russell Westbrook on their roster. We've seen James Harden and Russell Westbrook be together a couple different times in the NBA already. Obviously, we saw them together with OKC Thunder, 2 players at very different points in their career. We saw them together in Houston. I think the logical concern that a lot of people are going to point out is James Harden a very ball dominant player? And the counter would be, well, he led the league in assists last year. Well, I would say to that, there was a report that came out this offseason that one of the big things that was why James Harden wanted to return to Houston, aside from some 36 double Ds, was that James Harden wanted to be the guy again. James Harden wanted to be a league leading scorer again in the NBA. So I don't think that changes much, him going to the Clippers. So it kind of makes me wonder if he's also already setting himself to be unhappy going into this situation as well, because Ty Lue is one of the more well-respected coaches in the league. And I feel like he would be inclined to shut that shit down real fast if it was going to throw off team chemistry. How do you think Ty Lue balances this? Again, you're getting a very ball dominant, ISO-centric player, and you have to now get him to adjust around Kawhi, Paul George, and Russell Westbrook, who's your high energy guy.
I love the joke that was made on Twitter that Russell Westbrook and James Harden teaming up again with the Clippers is basically like those people who agreed to get married if both were single when they turned 40. Like, that's kind of the situation that they find themselves in, is like, well, we're kind of on the last run of our career. Let's try it one more time and see what happens. Because people forget that when they were together in the bubble, that Houston season, Russell Westbrook showed up to a team meeting and James wasn't there. And he was telling Mike D'Antoni, fuck it, start the meeting without him. And he's like, sorry, we can't start till James gets here. And James was like 15 minutes late. And Westbrook was like, yeah, no, this ain't going to happen. This ain't the get down for me. And Westbrook got a one-way ticket to Washington for a season. And look, both of them are very different players at this stage of their career. James Harden knows the situation he's walking into. It's the reason why they were walking into that situation in the first place. But the reason that this trade happened is because Kawhi Leonard and Paul George wanted James Harden. But Paul George was going on a podcast and like kind of alluding the idea that they wanted this to happen, that they wanted to bring in James Harden. And by the way, that Norman Powell was untouchable in a trade with the Philadelphia 76ers, which is funny to say that Norman Powell was untouchable in a deal to acquire James Harden, but that's because Norman Powell and Kawhi Leonard are like best friends. So like Kawhi Leonard is tinkering with this roster a little bit. And the fact that they now have a team that is built around essentially 7 players now. It's Kawhi, Paul George, James Harden, Russell Westbrook, Zubac, Terrence Mann, and Norman Powell. Like, that's the team that they're going to try and run it back within the playoffs. And I think that that's a very good team. Like, James Harden being your third best player. And we saw it in Philadelphia last year. At times, James Harden was the third best player on that team. Like, he was probably better than Tyrese Maxey more often than not. But as being a distributor, you saw Maxey's numbers increase. You saw Tobias Harris have a season since 2021, which is really only 2 years. But the point still stands. Like, they made the improvements that they needed with James Harden becoming more of a facilitator and leading the league in assists. So, yeah, James Harden's got that ability in his game. And remember, these guys are not going to be playing every game in the regular season. So like, it's going to be 2 of these guys playing at any given time between Kawhi and Paul George and Harden. They're going to probably have 2 or 3 of them playing together at any given time in the regular season. And when the playoffs roll around, Draymond Green talked about it last year. Egos get checked at the door when the playoffs roll around. Like, they go as far as Kawhi Leonard takes them when the playoffs roll around.
You say that the egos get checked at the door, and I think part of the Clippers' problem with this might actually be the fact that they're probably their best player, Kawhi Leonard, at this point, doesn't really have an ego. James Harden has an ego. I kind of wonder if a more passive superstar like a Kawhi Leonard would almost get walked over by a guy like James Harden, who's still trying to prove to himself that he belongs in that upper echelon of NBA superstars. Because I think James still thinks he's that guy. You say he doesn't think he's that guy anymore, and he knows what he's getting into. I don't think that's the case based off some of the offseason reports that we saw this season. I think James still believes that he can lead a team, that he can be one of the top 5 offensive scorers in the league again. And it kind of makes me wonder if Kawhi is going to be the type of person that would even say anything to him if that was not the case. Paul George, does he have that in him to like step up and tell James, no, this is how we got to do it? Hey, you mentioned Russell Westbrook. Russell Westbrook has no problem stepping up to him. But Russell Westbrook is also in a very vulnerable position in the NBA at this point himself, too. He doesn't have the type of leverage to just go up to the guy that they just traded all these assets to acquire and just say, hey, I think you need to be the one taking a back seat in any form or point of the season. So, I think that's kind of concerning. I think a lot of pressure is going to be on Ty Lue, as I mentioned earlier, to be able to regulate this locker room.
I would be careful with confusing Kawhi Leonard being quiet with Kawhi Leonard being passive, because this is the Kawhi Leonard who forced his way to the Clippers, was out there recruiting Jimmy Butler and Kevin Durant years ago to bring the Clippers together, is a guy that Paul George, I mean, if you've heard Paul George on his podcast, he's talked time and time again about like Kawhi is different inside the locker room than he is outside when presenting to people. Like I think Kawhi Leonard, when he first got to the Clippers, had a leadership problem, right? The reason they didn't win a championship that first year is because they looked at Kawhi as the guy. You're setting people for accountability. You're doing this, this, and this. And Kawhi didn't meet the mark. And that was part of why everything fell apart in the bubble and why they were all sick of each other, was that before the pandemic, Kawhi was pulling up late to practice. Kawhi Leonard, he got days off that other players didn't, and that wasn't communicated as to why. Like, he got special treatment up and down, and they've corrected that as the couple years have gone along, and Kawhi being on the bench for a season when he tore his knee kind of changed some of that stuff. But I wouldn't conflate Kawhi Leonard being quiet with Kawhi Leonard being passive in that sense.
Well, how does he compare to like Kevin Durant as a leader? Because we also got to go down the list with James Harden and some of these situations that have blown up over the last couple of years. Again, we're talking about a player that's been on 4 teams in just the last 3 years. So we have to talk about, how does James Harden work around other players? We thought it was going to work with KD. We thought, hey, they're buddies, they'll make this work. But the Kyrie stuff just ended up tearing that situation apart. We thought it was going to work with Joel. Hey, they're buddies, they go well together, they gel together. But whatever truths or untruths were told behind the scenes with him and Daryl Morey blew that situation up. Houston, we thought, hey, he was happy, he loved the lifestyle, he could have made it happen even with a rebuilding team. Didn't happen. He couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't stand the rebuild. So, James Harden, a lot of people are pointing at him as the potential problem. So I kind of wonder, like, can Kawhi be strong enough? Because he has to be strong enough. Is he stronger than Kevin Durant? We'll see. Kevin Durant, we've seen him talk whenever he voices his pleasure, but also we've also seen Kevin Durant be satisfied to just say, hey, I just want to play video games and basketball, right? So that's what he said before.
Yeah, and smoke weed. Kevin Durant also likes smoking weed. It's video games, basketball, smoking weed. That's Kevin Durant's trifecta. But for the James Harden aspect of it, like, James Harden knows what the get down is. Like, he's been on team now where he was the essentially number 3 in Brooklyn. Like, regardless of whether you thought he was good or bad, like, Kyrie and Kevin Durant had the power within that organization. He's been a number 3 for a season there. He's been a number 2 in Philadelphia now. Like, and James Harden, by the way, is the only NBA player to have made the second round of the playoffs each of the last 7 years, despite the fact that in those 7 years, he went from being MVP to number 1, but not MVP level in Houston, to then a number 3 in Brooklyn, to then a number 2 in Philadelphia. Like, he knows the get down at this point. I think it's a little disrespectful for people to be like, James Harden's going to blow this shit up once the playoffs roll around. Like, James, that's not going to happen. He knows the get down, but the difference is going to be whether this team is even good enough with James Harden as their number 3. And that's also assuming perfect good health. Because remember, Kawhi Leonard averaged like 40 points a game for his 2 playoff games last year. And then he messed up his knee, and Norman Powell was giving him 35 points in a playoff game.
Okay. Well, we did the same exercise with the Sacramento Kings. Like, who do you think they match up with? I think a lot of people are going to point to that Phoenix matchup. And hey, good news for them. They got PJ Tucker. He's going to stop Kevin Durant, right? The Kevin Durant stopper, PJ Tucker. So they look like they're fine against the Phoenix Suns. But Denver's still hanging around. We talked about Sacramento last week. The Lakers, as long as AD stays healthy and LeBron stays healthy, they still have a puncher's chance in those games as well. How do you think they stack up against the rest of the West right now?
Yeah, a lot of this is matchup based. I mean, regardless of whether they make the second round of the playoffs or the first round of the playoffs, like, the Western Conference is a gauntlet this year. There are teams that might be, I mean, we saw it last year. The 7 seed in the West made it to the conference finals, and the 6 seed made it to the second round of the playoffs with the Golden State Warriors last year. So, like, seeding is a little bit out of the picture here. Matchups is what's more important. I think the Clippers against any of those teams that are like 5 through 10 in the Western Conference, like Oklahoma City or Timberwolves or the Pelicans or even Memphis, who I know is off to a really rough start, and Steven Adams is out for the season. Like, against those teams, the Clippers should be able to win in a 7-game series. It's maybe not any given night they'll be able to beat those teams, but over 7 games when fully healthy, with the understanding Kawhi Leonard is the number one, they can beat those teams. I think where things get shaky for them is Denver, the Lakers, Phoenix, and I might even go so far as to say Sacramento. Like, maybe Sacramento is right there in that same group, but if for example, we had a 4 versus 5 first round matchup this year between Sacramento and the Clippers, oh my Lord, that would be an amazing series. Like, I guarantee you that series would go 7 games. If you had a 7-game series between the Clippers and the Warriors, I almost guarantee you that series would go 7 games. Now, I think the Clippers would be uniquely positioned on a defensive side of the ball to play against the Warriors, which is hard to say because the Warriors have Steph Curry, and Steph Curry just goes God mode at times, and he's just that good. But like, that 4 through 7 range in the West is probably where the Clippers stand right now. And regardless of whether they get to the second round of the playoffs or the first, or they lose in the first round because they happen to get the 6th seed and play the 3-seeded Denver Nuggets or something like that, like, regardless of the point, I think that the Clippers are in that like 4 to 7 range of teams in the Western Conference right now.
Who won the trade? The Philadelphia 76ers or Los Angeles Clippers? Weigh in the comment section. Leave a like on the video. Subscribe to the channel. Follow us on all our social medias from Juju and Kyle. Stay safe, happy, and healthy. We'll see you next time.